Give us a few seconds as people start entering the webinar. Welcome, everyone. Those just joining, we're just waiting a few more seconds as people come in. Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We'll give it one more minute as people continue to join. All right, everyone. So hello and welcome to our webinar today. We'll begin the introductions in a few minutes after we've gone over the logistics for setting up closed captioning, since this will be an English and Spanish event. Next slide. Live captioning is available. If you see this icon on the slide, click the closed caption button on the lower left-hand side of your screen. You can view or hide captions. I'll pause for a second to give you all time if necessary. Next slide. To reflect your preferred language in the captions, you must click the closed caption button and select the preferred language via the drop-down arrow. So the caption language, which is the second option, will set your preferred language. And if you select it now, it will remain enabled for the full event. Next slide. To remain connected to audio, you can connect to your computer audio as seen on this slide, or you can use the WebEx Call Me feature. and receive an automated call from WebEx, which will connect you through your phone. Next slide. We will be doing question and answer in the last 15 minutes of the presentation today, so please submit your questions for our panelists in the chat window as seen here. And in the next slide, I will go through the same information, but in Spanish. Para este evento están disponibles los subtítulos en tiempo real. Haz clic en el botón de subtítulos en su lado izquierdo de su pantalla para ver o ocultar los subtítulos. También es necesario seleccionar su lenguaje preferido y para hacer esto, haz clic en la flecha pequeña al lado del botón de subtítulos. Este evento está siendo grabado y durante los últimos 15 minutos los panelistas van a contestar las preguntas de la audiencia. Por favor, manden sus preguntas en el chat de WebEx. Next slide. Thank you all for attending today's webinar titled Irregular Migration to the U.S. from Central America, Understanding the Drivers and Outlining the Responses. My name is Marisa Cuellar. I'm an analyst within the domestic division at APT Associates, and I serve as the overall chair for APT's internal employee networking group, Somos APT. Somos APT is one of 7 affinity groups within APT Associates, and our mission is to support and advocate for staff who self-identify as Latino, Latina, Latinx, or Hispanic, or anything else. We do this by hosting internal events such as book discussions, Spanish and Portuguese language social hours, and by highlighting important issues specific to Latin America and the Caribbean and within the United States as well. We're proud to host today's webinar where we will be discussing root causes and impacts of migration from Central America, which is one of the most important issues the region is currently facing. Next slide of our agenda here. And after introducing our panelists, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Sarah. And our agenda today will feature a discussion on the drivers of migration and the lived experience of someone who migrated from Guatemala to Mexico. We will then hear about U.S. strategies and responses to migration from the U.S. Agency for International Development. And during the last 15 minutes, I will moderate the question and answer portion of today's webinar. As a reminder, please submit your questions through the WebEx chat. Next slide. Our panelists today include Manuel Orozco, Russell Porter, and Aura Marina Luis, who goes by Audi. Manuel Orozco is the director of the Migration, Remittances, and Development Project at the Inter-American Dialogue. Manuel is also a senior fellow at Harvard University's Center for International Development and a senior advisor with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. He has conducted extensive research, policy analysis, and advocacy on issues relating to global flows of remittances, as well as migration and development worldwide, and has published widely on the topic. Russell Porter is the Deputy Director for the Central America and Mexico Office at USAID and Staff Director of the Northern Triangle Task Force, where he provides strategic direction and oversight for the programming in the region and has held several leadership roles during his 25-year tenure. He led the development of the root causes strategy for USAID, managed interagency coordination, and oversaw the alignment of USAID programs under the new strategy. Our third panelist, Audi, is an office worker and human rights advocate from Huehuetenango, Guatemala. In Guatemala, she faced economic challenges and gender-based violence, which compelled her to migrate to Mexico. Audi currently resides in Guatemala and has kindly agreed to share her experiences with us. And finally, our moderator today is Sarah Jones, APT's technical lead for governance, economic growth, and migration, supporting work in the Latin America and Caribbean, Asia, and Eastern Europe regions. She has over 20 years of experience in international development, gained through US-based and overseas positions. Her technical expertise focuses on governance strengthening, citizen security, violence prevention, economic growth, and irregular migration. She has lived in South Asia, the Middle East, Central Eastern Africa, and Eastern Europe, and over the last several years has worked extensively on migration-focused programming in Central America. We want to thank our panelists for agreeing to share their lived experience and expertise with us today. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Sarah Jones.
Great, thank you very much, Marissa, and thank you so much, ACT. I want to welcome our panel once again to today's discussion. And welcome as well to all of those joining us today online. As Marissa mentioned, we've divided this discussion into 3 segments, and we'll begin now by spending about 30 minutes discussing the drivers of irregular migration themselves from different angles. As Marissa also mentioned, please feel free to add any questions you have into the chat. That can be done throughout our discussion today, and then my colleagues and I will compile those and present those at the end of our event today. So to begin our discussion on irregular migration drivers, Manuel Orozco is going to spend about 10 minutes discussing the key drivers of migration from Central America, how they differ across countries, and how they've changed over time. So Manuel, thank you very much, and over to you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, clear.
Thank you for the invitation and to share some of the views on the issue of the determinants of migration. What I'm going to do is just bring up 4 main points. One is the historical trajectory of Central American migration for at least 50, 60 years. Second, address some of the key determinants of migration. And 3, point out a little about the main problem of migration. And finally, just reflect on future migration trends. The relevance of talking about migration today is important not only because the trajectory of labor mobilization and human mobilization in general will likely continue, but will take on different shape perhaps and smaller numbers to some extent, but it will have implications for Central America. It's also important because the United States has implemented in the past 2 years or put in place at least 4 different policy initiatives that may have a significant impact not only on migration but on regional development. To start with, the point of departure is that yes, Central America has a historic tradition of international migration that may date since the post-World II period, but it really intensifies in the 1980s during the civil wars that took place in those countries, where nearly 500,000 people migrated from the region. That sets a series of continuous engagements that leads to a second migration wave in the 1990s, where with the pacification and economic stabilization pattern, there is transnational engagement of migrants with their homeland as the peace agreements are reached. But really, it intensifies in the 21st century, in 2000, where there is a confluence of factors. One of the most critical one is that there is an effective demand of foreign labor in the United States, particularly low-skilled labor, that increases the mobility of people getting out. That in exchange or in relationship with the transnational ties, and then with the confluence of organized crime networks that have an effect on human mobility, migration increases significantly. But it's perhaps in 2009 when we see one of the largest migratory waves that is connected predominantly to the intensification of organized crime networks, but also with the practical deterioration of the economic model of growth that Central America has been carrying out for the past, well, at least during the 20th century in general, and with the recession that is unable to provide substantive spaces for people to get out of it in a short period of time. So practically between 2012 to the present, and on average, at least 300,000 people have migrated from Central America. That's effectively at least 1% of the population. Last year, we were talking about 500,000 people who left Central America and came to the US border. 90% of Central American migration is predominantly irregular. And the main issue here is that you see a complexity of factors explaining or shaping the intention to migrate. And that takes me to the second point. The determinants, that is the specific factors that lead people to migrate, are connected to a range of things. There is not a single issue that you can raise causality to explain migration. But you can identify two broad points. One is aspirational and the other one is material. Aspirational is those perceptions that people have over the future of the economy, of the future of the system, of society and the political conditions in the country that don't seem to be prone to stay in the homeland. And the material ones have to do with jobs, with the type of workplace that you are set, with violence, as well as with the effects of natural disasters on the property of individuals. So what we find predominantly is three main common determinants of migration. The first one is the informal economy. People who work in the informal economy are more likely to migrate. The intention to migrate is 2 times greater among those who are working in the informal economy than those who are not. The second one, that is across Central America, or at least the 4 countries of Central America, is the aspirational one. Perceiving that you're working, that you don't see much future in your home country, increases the intention to migrate significantly. The other factor is receiving remittances and not owning property. And I can elaborate what that means, because it can lend itself to a lot of interpretations. And then there are differences across country where there are certain correlates that are country specific. For example, in Honduras, homicides are strongly correlated to the intention to migrate, whereas in El Salvador is gender-based violence that is strongly correlated to migration. During different points in time, the natural disaster destruction of people's property has an effect also on the intention to migrate. In the case of Nicaragua, it's an important one. It's been somewhat different up until 2018. The size of Nicaraguan migration was relatively small. Relatively small meaning less than 20,000 people will migrate, and there will be a return over a cyclical pattern of less than 18 months. However, the political crisis led to a significant wave of migration, to the extent to which the political crisis has been the key determinant affecting people's decision to migrate. In a matter of 4 years, between 2018 and 2022, 600,000 people left Nicaragua. This is a country of 6.5 million people. In 2017, there were 600,000 Nicaraguans living abroad. Today, there are 1.3 million. So, the magnitude of the outflow, it's just reflecting of a significant different nature explaining migration. But in the 4 countries, the continued flow and decision to migrate is significant. In practical terms, we can say that 25% of households in Central America have a relative with an intention to migrate. Of those, 1/3 actually leaves their home country, and of those, 2/3 actually make it to the United States. So we're talking about a critical mass of people who actually make the effort to get out of the country and eventually makes it. So, the fundamental problem of all this has to do predominantly with the reluctance of the political and economic elites to take the risk of supporting a democratic transition that will consolidate democratic institutions, but also the inability of the economic elites to change the model of economic growth. The growth model in Central America is one that is predominantly focused on 2 pillars. One is predominantly the outsourcing economy, free trade zone, and agricultural exports. And the other one is everything else, the informal economy. So you have over 70% of the labor force working in the informal economy, and then you have less than 25% of the labor force working in government or in the formal sector, predominantly in agro exports or in the free trade zone. whatever doesn't fit in there, or if you realize that you don't can make ends meet, you migrate and leave the country. So at the end of the day, migration becomes the missing middle of economic growth. In fact, today, because of family remittances, the economies of Central America are extremely dependent on these flows. Practically 25% of GDP is coming from remittances. So $1 in $4 is predominantly money from workers who could not stay in their home country because of the conditions there. So that's the broader context of the determinants of migration, why people migrate, some of the differences, and finally, a word on the future flow of migration. Is this likely to continue? Yes. In what numbers? Well, the absolute number might be lower than it was last year. 2021 and 2022 did not exhibit the traditional number because it reflected the characteristics of people who have postponed their decision to migrate during the pandemic. So you see a huge growth of migrants in 2021 and 2022. This year it will be slower than 22, and it will be similar to the trend that occurred prior to 2019. A smaller number, 350,000 people perhaps, with perhaps the exception of Nicaragua, where the volume of people getting out has been of a large critical mass. So there is another factor to consider, however. We have learned that when the size of your population living abroad, it's 17% or more of your total population, the growth of migration begins to decline. And so all of the Central American countries have reached that 17% level, with the exception of Guatemala, that is at 15%. But Honduras has reached, El Salvador has, Nicaragua has. What does that mean? That you will have a slowdown in migration because of demographic patterns. That is, the economically active sector of the labor force has left out in larger numbers. The ones that are staying are the elderly and the underage. So the implications for this are really something that we need to take seriously, because without an economic strategy that addresses, on the one hand, the factors affecting migration in a more structural context, and second, that has not leveraged on the flow of remittances on basically 25% of economic growth, you will have a slower economic growth. That is, if you don't change the current model of economic growth and do not leverage remittances with this slowing down of migration, you're going to have a serious problem of wider consequences for the region. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Manuel, thank you very much. These complex, often integrated migration drivers that are such an important focus for the development community, of course, present extreme challenges for people who are experiencing them directly. Auri Louise has very kindly agreed to share some of her perspectives and experiences with us today. So we're going to turn to Spanish for this part of the discussion. Auri, una vez más, muchas gracias por compartir sus perspectivas y algo de su historia con nosotros hoy. ¿Podría compartir un poco de su historia y por qué dejó su país? Gracias.
Muchas gracias, buenos días para todos. Les cuento que acá en Guatemala amaneció una mañana bastante lluviosa y amanecimos sin energía eléctrica, pero ahí está. Bien, como mencionaba, mi nombre es Auri Luis, soy trabajadora social una maestría en educación, que actualmente trabaja para la Secretaría de Seguridad Alimentaria y Nutricional. Anteriormente trabajaba para otra dependencia del Estado, no voy a mencionar para qué dependencia, pero en esta dependencia sufrí violencia de género, específicamente abusos por parte de los patronos, eh, muy renuentes. eh, Ellos tienen el poder y por eso pueden marginar a las mujeres jóvenes que tienen necesidad de trabajar, pagándoles un salario muy bajo, no acorde a las capacidades y imponiendo su poder en todo momento. Eh, el machismo muy sobresaliente en este aspecto. Todos esos factores, yo era directora de una de las dependencias de la institución a la cual trabajaba. Eh, pues mis jefes muy machistas, eh, acoso, sufrí acoso laboral, acoso sexual de parte de los jefes. Eh, Todos estos factores hicieron de que yo tomara la decisión de emigrar hacia México, ¿verdad? Prácticamente huir de toda esta situación en mi aspecto laboral. Ya estando con el grupo, con las personas que íbamos a cruzar la frontera, ya para cruzar a México, ya para tomar la ruta hacia Estados Unidos, ya estando ya en el punto de reunión, en este caso en una de las fronteras, ¿verdad?, de Guatemala a México, recibo una llamada de mi mamá. O sea, y aún yo sabiendo y conociendo todos los riesgos, las consecuencias que uno sufre durante el tránsito, ¿verdad?, del viaje, estaba decidida a ya había tomado la decisión y estaba decidida ya a viajar, prácticamente huyendo de la violencia que sufría en mi espacio laboral. Recibo una llamada de mi mamá y ella me dice, mira, conocer cuáles son las consecuencias, cuál es la situación a la que te vas a enfrentar allá. Mira, acá estudiaste, puedes buscar otras opciones, pero yo aferrada y por la pena y el miedo, y decía, bueno, si me salgo de este trabajo y vuelvo a otro, pues me va a pasar lo mismo, voy a volver a sufrir la misma situación. Pero viendo la situación de mi mamá, haciendo el análisis que tampoco tenía todo el dinero para poder pagarle, en este caso le llamamos coyotes a las personas que nos cruzan, ¿verdad? Para el otro lado. No tenía específicamente toda la cantidad de dinero. Eso hace que me detenga y que regrese a Guatemala. Pero lamentablemente en Guatemala no hay muchas oportunidades para personas jóvenes, mucho menos para las personas jóvenes que no tienen mucha experiencia, porque capacidad sí tenemos, pero quizá experiencia laboral no, ¿verdad? Entonces, esto hace que yo regrese nuevamente al trabajo que tenía, a los mismos jefes, pero ya a una situación más incómoda, una situación ya muy tediosa, porque ya todos lo miran a uno con malos ojos, con malas miradas, ya todo es eh, uno pide un favor, ya te lo hacen de mala gana. Entonces, regreso a ese nuevo trabajo, ya solo por un par de meses más, porque luego, gracias a Dios, me dan la oportunidad ya en la secretaría donde actualmente estoy. Llevo ya laborando aproximadamente 5 meses y pues ahora donde estoy pues me siento más feliz, los jefes son más eh, buenas personas. Lo único es, ¿verdad?, que seguimos con los salarios un poco bajos, pero sí son mejores tratos, ¿verdad?, a, al, a los trabajadores. Y entonces, esos son muchos factores, ¿verdad?, de que han generado que muchos jóvenes migremos y tomemos la decisión de arriesgar nuestra vida y cruzar hacia el otro lado por ir huyendo no solo de la pobreza, sino de los malos tratos de las personas, ¿verdad? Yo pues desde niña he sufrido algunos otros factores de discriminación. Crecí sin una figura paterna. A los 7 años mi padre falleció en un accidente. Desde entonces he ido trabajando en diferentes espacios de niña. Sin embargo, la violencia que se sufre en el país, los abusos laborales desde niña los he sufrido, ¿verdad? En este sentido, la discriminación, por supuesto. Entonces, hay muchos factores que influyen en que uno como joven migre, tome esa decisión. Más que todo, uno se va huyendo de la violencia que vive en Guatemala.
Muchas gracias, Ari, por compartir sus experiencias y sus perspectivas. Gracias. And Russell, working at the policy level, which of the challenges outlined by our speakers would be considered the biggest priorities for the U.S. government and USAID?
Hi, Sarah. And first, thank you very much for organizing and putting together this interesting discussion today. And it's a real honor to be on the same panel as Manuel Orozco and Auri. I think, it's in being able to have these discussions from both the macro and micro level of the policy and individual perspectives, I think is really interesting and a unique discussion point. So I think from our perspective, what we have looked at is the challenges of migration at the root causes level is a long-term endeavor. And so a year and a half ago, we put together a new strategy for the region focused on the 3 countries of Central America with the goal of addressing sort of these long-term issues that have been sort of the underlying drivers of migration. I think Manuel did a good job of sort of really highlighting what some of those are, both the economic, political, and citizen and security related, that have really affected people's decision and individual decisions to make this difficult journey, as you were just hearing from Aria about her decisions and the difficulties of why people migrate and the challenges of how they get there. So with the 2 strategies that sort of work hand in glove here is the root causes strategy for the drivers of migration and the collaborative migration management strategy that sort of looks at sort of the legal pathways and other assessments of how people can get to the United States. For our purposes, we focus primarily on the root causes strategy to address the problems that give irregular migration to the U.S. And so there are 5 pillars within the strategy that the first is addressing economic insecurity and inequality. The second is focusing on combating corruption, strengthening democratic governance, and advocating or advancing the rule of law. The third is promoting respect for human rights, labor rights, free press. And the fourth, countering and preventing violence, extortion, other crimes, particularly by gangs in the region. And then the fifth is combating sexual and gender-based and domestic violence. And I think what we just heard, explains why that is such a key factor. And the goal here is to focus on sort of a long-term effort to address these issues. We also have generally focused on areas within the strategy of highest out migration. So we've looked at geographic areas and why and where people are leaving from within primarily these 3 countries, and sort of how we're implementing this at the local level. And the way we're doing it in each country, I think it's important to note, is tailored for that country and sort of the unique aspects. And so we have our AID missions, as people know, and we have looked to tailor and craft our implementation at the local level. And more on that a little bit later. But I think the ultimate success of this is really, hinging upon a sustained long-term engagement, both through economic development programs that AID is employing, as well as diplomatic engagement and the political will of local leaders to seek sort of this sort of shift and change, because I think as Manuel noted about the importance of the future shifts in economic growth and sort of how this migration trends impact that. I think the recognition of why and how that will impact this over time is important. So, some of the results that we've had since we began this, the shift in the implementation of the strategy a year and a half ago, and we've have one sort of fiscal year of budgeting and under our belt, which was FY21, which was appropriated under the previous administration, and we're just now getting to the FY22 funds, which were appropriated under the current administration. And so, it's a long-term endeavor, both in the implementation and getting the funding on the ground. But I'm sure many of the people in the audience are aware of the challenges of getting some of this funding out the door. But yet, I think we have seen some successes along the way, and I in particular under these underpinnings of development, we're under Pillar 1, under education, we've reached currently more than almost 500,000 youth through support for primary and secondary education. And again, these are targeted in areas of high out migration, and we've supported nearly 8,000 private sector firms in Northern Central America and helping to create 90,000 jobs. And this is sort of getting to one of the key areas that Manuel pointed out, which is the moving people from the informal economy to the formal economy and getting people sort of more ingrained into the system, more ownership within the system. And I think you'll hear that as a trend as part of all of our assistance through the region. With Pillar 2 and anti-corruption, we're in the process of looking at of new ways we can address corruption issues. And it's clearly a very difficult challenge, both on the foreign assistance side, the diplomatic side, I think, and as well on the governance side. And it's the political will issue that I mentioned before, the need to really sort of create the right motivations for people to make good choices in fighting corruption. USAID programs in the 3 countries, we've trained thus far more than 5,000 national and local government officials to implement internationally recognized transparency and accountability standards to fight corruption. We've been working with prosecutors, we've been working with others within the system. We've been trying to streamline processes within governance to create more electronic ways of doing business, which takes out potential areas of corruption. So these are mechanical things that we can do, but it also, again, takes the political will of leadership in countries to take this on as a changing in the way we do business. On human rights, there's been a lot of challenges. I think, we see a number of challenges now, particularly in Guatemala. And in fact, there was a very good op-ed today in the Washington Post by Ruben Zamora's son, who is here, and Zamora's been imprisoned since last year in Guatemala. And through our programs, we've supported more than 350 civil society organizations that have advocated for human rights, particularly those focused on marginal and underrepresented communities. We have supported press and press freedoms. We have supported the ability for NGOs through our Voices initiative to strengthen civil society, the ability of individuals and groups to have their voices heard, and that's been a challenge over time. But I think again, it's a long-term prospect that we've been supporting and will continue to do so. On countering violence, this has been a long-term endeavor from AID through the Central America Regional Security Initiative, where we have a great partnership with State Department and their Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. We have been working with them. We've supported more than 50,000 at-risk youth with violence prevention services. I think we've seen, and we have clearly some challenges in implementation in the region. I would note, obviously, El Salvador, where the government has taken a new approach towards rounding up the gangs, without due process, and I think that may have its own long-term consequences, and we can have a discussion about that, but we've continued to work at-risk youth throughout the region, trying to help youth get on the right path and not join gangs by having an alternative. Finally, with GBV, with gender-based violence, USAID has provided services to more than 30,000 survivors of gender-based violence in Honduras and Guatemala. We've reached more than 2,500 women, youth, and indigenous people in Guatemala with education and other activities, also designed to combat trafficking in persons. And then, so as part of this strategy, though, has been focused on increasing partnerships. And so it's not just AID doing it alone, but building partnerships. On the private sector side, I think people are probably familiar with what the Vice President announced last month with Central America Forward, which is bringing together a number of initiatives under one banner, Central America Forward, including the call to action, which was announced in May of 2021 to increase foreign direct investment into the region. 13 of the call to action members, there are 47 of them, are AID partners. There's also AID's role in, as part of our role in Central America Forward, we're seeking to attract investment by with our support for the private sector, building those partnerships locally to build a region that is more export competitive, building the capacity of governments to attract that foreign investment and to create and facilitate trade within the region that would obviously benefit the United States through increased trade as companies look to diversify from China. We also have launched the Central America Service Corps. The goal there is to focus on youth, getting youth more engaged with mentorships, volunteer opportunities, ways to get involved in their own community. This was funded through an earmark from Congress last year. We also have built a partnership with Mexico and their development agency, AMEXID. And Mexico has a different approach to development than AID, but it's where we have linked their support for youth and agriculture in the region with our value chain development programs, helping to link their beneficiaries to the purchasers and buyers within the value chains we've been supporting to help further enable the building of sort of long-term, sort of formal employment. So, other ways, we're doing a lot in legal migration. We've been working with ministries of labor, foreign ministries to help build the capacity for H-2 visas, both in agriculture and H-2B non-ag ways for people to get to the United States. We have a good partnership in each of the 3 countries, and particularly with the Department of Homeland Security, where the more you can encourage people to do a legal migration to the United States, if temporary, it helps facilitate the process. It protects the workers. It allows for just a better system, I think we would all, versus the irregular migration. And then, what does the future hold? I think, the statistics that Manuel gave, I thought were striking. And I think as we look at it, the governance side, the trends in Central America, where we've seen the percentage of Central Americans decline, but the rise in Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, Cubans. I mean, there were 300,000 Cubans who came to the southwest border last year. There were more Nicaraguans last year than Central Americans. So, I think as we see this trend, I think that it's going to be hard for us to address these because of the short-term pressures. And then finally, I think everyone has heard about the Centro America Local initiative that the administrator announced almost a year and a half ago, where we're looking to provide about 240 million through local organizations. And that is off to a very good start. And I think the goal here is to increase the input of local organizations who are more on the ground, working with our international partners, and I think increasing that mix of local voices into what we're doing and how we do it is the goal of this initiative. And AID has been looking to increase staff and adjusting our implementation and how we partner with local groups so that we can increase those opportunities for local NGOs. I've tried to cover a lot in a short period of time. Thank you for the opportunity, and happy to address questions or discuss any of these. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Russell, for that very important overview. I'm certain everyone joining today really appreciated hearing that comprehensive, integrated overview on behalf of the U.S. government. And thank you as well to our whole panel for this part of our discussion. We are shifting to a discussion on responses to migration now, and we've begun discussing that here. I'm going to turn back to Auri right now and ask her a few questions. Auri, tengo una pregunta. Si pudiera haber cambiado algo sobre su país o sus perspectivas, ¿cuáles serían los motivos principales que la hubiesen inclinado a quedarse? Gracias.
Ok, muchas gracias. Considero que lo que hubiera quedarme en Guatemala, primero, mejores opciones de trabajo. Mencioné en mi intervención anterior de que como jóvenes, ser mujer joven en Guatemala es muy difícil porque somos consideradas el sexo débil en todos los aspectos, tanto laborales, económicos, o sea, en el aspecto social específicamente. Entonces, nuestra remuneración laboral es menor que la que tiene un hombre. Entonces, mejores tratos laborales, mejores oportunidades laborales, hubiera sido un factor elemental para quedarme en mi país y no tener esa ideología de querer migrar. Mencionaba que soy profesional con un alto nivel académico, sin embargo, no gano como profesional. Estaba en el empleo anterior, estaba sobre el salario mínimo, teniendo un nivel académico súper alto, podríamos decir, acá en Guatemala, y ganando un salario mínimo, lo cual no alcanza, ¿verdad? Ni para cubrir lo que es la canasta básica en el país, viendo el alza, ¿verdad? De los productos, la economía, cómo está actualmente y cómo ya con el salario mínimo ya no podemos cubrir las necesidades básicas de nuestro hogar. Entonces, un mejor pago salarial y mejores oportunidades acorde a nuestra profesión o, y sobre todo, más que todo, oportunidades de empleo y con mejores tratos. Esa hubiera sido la opción específica y relevante para quedarme yo en mi país y no pensar en migrar a, a Estados Unidos. Conocemos que la travesía a Estados Unidos es complicada porque está uno propenso a caer en manos del crimen organizado, a sufrir accidentes, malos tratos, discriminación por las doctrinas políticas, ¿verdad?, que se manejan. Entonces, eh, vamos que las oportunidades de empleo son un factor muy importante para no solo para el desarrollo del país, sino para el desarrollo humano. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Auri. Tengo una otra pregunta. ¿Cuáles fueron sus experiencias cuando regresó a Guatemala y qué hubiera hecho más fácil su regreso? Gracias.
¿Podría repetir la pregunta, por favor?
Sí, perdón. La pregunta es, ¿cuáles fueron sus experiencias cuando regresó a Guatemala y también qué hubiera hecho más fácil su regreso?
Gracias. Bueno, eh, fue un reto por regresar a Guatemala y tener que regresar al mismo empleo, sabiendo que ahí recibía malos tratos, que recibía abusos. Sin embargo, volvemos a recaer que la falta de oportunidades eh, me hicieron a que regresara al mismo empleo. Entonces, para mí fue un reto porque sabía que me iba a enfrentar a más problemas, porque ya había salido una vez de ahí y volver, llegar nuevamente, fue así como que te tomas de valor y regresas porque no tienes otra alternativa, porque no tienes otras opciones y tienes que aguantar los malos tratos hasta donde, como lo decimos acá en Guatemala, hasta donde el cuerpo aguante, ¿verdad? Porque no hay otra opción. Sin embargo, ¿verdad? Vamos llegué, fue un reto grande, lo enfrenté. Dios me dio el valor para poder enfrentarme a esta situación, a estos nuevos desafíos y a estos malos tratos, ¿verdad? Mientras encontraba otra oportunidad laboral. Y así fue, ¿verdad? Podría decir que soporté por 2 meses más esos malos tratos, esas actitudes negativas de parte de mis jefes. Ya cuando yo regresé, ya no era solo los malos tratos de los jefes, sino ya de todos los compañeros en el área laboral, ¿verdad? Porque esta se fue, ¿qué hace aquí nuevamente, verdad? Y que se vaya, algo así. Entonces ya es una situación a la que uno se tiene que enfrentar, entonces ya son nuevos desafíos, ¿verdad? Entonces, eh, a eso me enfrenté, ¿verdad? A esa situación eh, más tediosa, y, pero sin embargo, Dios, el destino, me da la oportunidad de cambiarme de trabajo y ahí ya es una nueva experiencia, ¿verdad? Ya es una nueva forma de ver la vida, de ver las cosas, o sea, cómo se va uno desenvolviendo en otros ámbitos. Entonces ya el trato ya es mejor, ya la remuneración laboral ya es mejor. Entonces a eso, ¿verdad? Me enfrenté cuando regresé. Esa experiencia que uno vive eh, hace que tal vez uno se vuelva más fuerte y pueda enfrentar esos desafíos que la vida le, podríamos decir que la vida le presenta a uno en este país. Y lo que hubiera hecho más fácil mi regreso sería que, eh, por ejemplo, una empresa, por decirlo así, hubiera contratado mis servicios sin importar el nivel de experiencia que uno tiene, porque vamos a que como jóvenes somos visionarios, tenemos otras visiones, somos innovadores, tenemos otras expectativas, tenemos nuevas ideas, tenemos conocimientos frescos, podríamos decir. Sin embargo, acá en nuestro país hay algunas instituciones de Estado que se atreven a pedir 5 o 6 años de experiencia y hasta con un rango de edad que uno tiene que cumplir para poder aplicar a una plaza laboral. Sin embargo, ¿verdad? Si nadie confía en un joven, no le da la oportunidad de desenvolverse en un área laboral, nunca va a poder obtener experiencia. Entonces, aunque uno tenga los conocimientos, tenga la preparación, tenga la capacidad, pero si las empresas no confían en la capacidad de la juventud, o sea, nunca van a saber de qué estamos hechos, nunca van a saber qué tanto somos capaces de hacer, nunca van a conocer nuestras visiones, nuestras innovaciones, nuestros talentos. Eh, esa es una debilidad, podría yo decir, que vemos en todo el sistema laboral, que nos piden muchos años de experiencia, pero no ponen a prueba nuestra capacidad. Entonces, y eso es lo que ha generado también de que muchos jóvenes mejor migren porque no les dan la oportunidad de desenvolverse en un área, debido a que no tienen experiencia, que están muy jóvenes, los consideran que no podemos hacer las cosas, ¿verdad? Entonces, una oportunidad de trabajo así eh, muy buena hubiera sido más fácil mi regreso, ¿verdad? Y a Guatemala. Entonces, esa es tal vez es una situación a la que nos enfrentamos todos los jóvenes día con día, ¿verdad? Solo para comentarle que yo me gradué en el 2010 de secretaria y oficinista. Tuvieron que pasar 9 años para que una empresa contratara mi servicio, porque cuando me gradué era muy joven, no tenía experiencia laboral, tenía conocimientos y preparación, pero no tenía experiencia. Entonces, eso hacía que las empresas no me contrataran. Pasaron 9 años para que una empresa, de hecho, cuando yo fui a la entrevista y le digo a la persona que me entrevistó, mire, fíjese que nunca he trabajado. La persona que me entrevista me pregunta, ¿cuál es su experiencia laboral? Y le digo yo, fíjese que nunca he trabajado porque nunca nadie ha creído en mi persona. Eh, pero sí tengo la capacidad y si usted me da la oportunidad de trabajar, yo le voy a demostrar qué tanto puedo hacer. Y se me queda viendo a la cara y le da la risa. Después pasa el proceso de entrevista y luego me llaman y te ¿por qué te contraté? Y yo con aquella duda y las inquietudes le pregunto ¿por qué? Porque fuiste muy sincera y me dijiste que nadie te había dado la oportunidad, pero yo sí creo en vos. Y me da la oportunidad y al final fue un trabajo exitoso el que yo le desarrollé a esa persona, ¿verdad? Entonces, ahí nos está la capacidad que tenemos como jóvenes, pero muchas personas, muchas empresas no creen en nuestras capacidades por el hecho de ser muy jóvenes, porque somos recién graduados que acabamos de salir de la escuela, que no tenemos la capacidad. Sin embargo, somos jóvenes visionarios, con mucha capacidad, con muchos talentos, nuevas ideas, ideas frescas, que podemos hacer cambiar tal vez un sistema que se viene arrastrando, por decirlo así, en pocas palabras chapinas, de muchos años a cambiar a un desarrollo más diferente, ¿verdad? Con nuevas innovaciones. Entonces, Eh, eh, esos son factores, ¿verdad? Entonces vamos a que hubiera hecho más fácil mi regreso o no hubiera tomado decisiones si las empresas creyeran en nosotros o alguien hubiera creído en mí, me hubiera dicho, mira, te doy una oportunidad de trabajo con mejor remuneración. Uno como joven está dispuesto a trabajar o sea, uno sabe que todo trabajo tiene que ser con resultados y uno tiene esa visión y sabe que tiene que cumplir con los resultados, ¿verdad? Que la empresa requiere para cumplir sus metas, para cumplir sus desafíos y para cumplir, ¿verdad? Todo lo que tienen planificado. Entonces, eso creo y estoy segura que hubiera hecho más fácil una laboral así que cumpliera o sea, que hubiera creído en mis capacidades, en mis talentos y sobre todo ese buen trato, ¿verdad? Como persona, porque creo que para que una persona se desempeñe también muy bien en el área laboral, pues tiene que haber un buen trato, sobre todo el trato personal, tanto de los jefes hacia los trabajadores. Y eso va a hacer de que un trabajador rinda más, que un trabajador se pueda desenvolver más de los resultados requeridos por la empresa. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Ari. And now we'll turn. I have a question for Manuel. Manuel, based on your research and experience, what do you think is missing from the responses to irregular migration to date? And what do you think are some of the development solutions or strategies that would be most impactful? Thank you.
That's a very long that will take a lot of time to answer. I think, I mean, a lot of what the current government Biden administration's approach is taking is relatively important. I mean, when you think in terms of economic development, you try to apply a triangulation between purpose, proportion, and precision. Precision in making sure that there is 100% correspondence between the problem and the solution. Sometimes we missed a lot of that because the decision of providing financial assistance comes with a strong political backing and not with sound analysis of the ground. And I can, I can explain a lot of those issues on some of the initiatives. However, the root causes strategy approach and opportunities, for example, it's a really important one and should be making more of an effort on the issue of the informal economy. It's something that we've been talking about for 20 years, foreign assistance. Nearly $20 billion in foreign assistance to Central America have gone to, and the budget on economic growth, and particularly on this sector of the economy, has been less than 5%. So now you see a different approach to this, and that's a welcoming component. But when it comes to proportion, we need to address the economies of scale. That's where I see we are missing one important leverage, and that's the effect of remittances on allowing you to increase foreign savings into the local economy through savings formalization, mobilizing to credit. And that's an alternative element that minimizes the risk of investing in the local economy, because the high risk attached to economy, to investing in the local economy is the critical factor of why we have an informal sector. Because the banking sector in Central America does not want to invest in the informal economy because they think they are a high risk when they are not. And so the importance element of modernizing the informal economy with economic of scale approach, partnering with the flow of remittances that you formalize their savings and mobilize them into credit can mitigate those risks. Because you are not compromising only the credit provided by the banking sector, but you are capitalizing on the flows of savings that come from remittance recipients. And we're talking about billions of dollars. Remember, Central America is composed predominantly of less than 11 million households. 4 million of them receive remittances, and they have a stock of savings that together may amount to $2 billion. So mobilizing that by formalizing them first into the local economy, into the local financial system, will have an important effect. So, and then the main purpose, I think, is one thing that the administration is missing the point. And I don't know if it's for political reasons or not, of an issue of precision, etc. But the purpose of addressing the issue of migration is to modernize and move away from the current model of growth that is predominantly focused on strengthening oligopolies. Even CAFTA itself, it's an economic, it's a trade process that is attached predominantly by a few firms that handle, most of the exporting of Central America to the United States. In particular, the free trade zone, 60% of exports under CAFTA come from the free trade zone. And we're talking about no more than 1,000 firms. And they're all American investors connected to local manufacturing businesses. But the connections are not making sense in terms of complying with some of the regulatory components of labor rights, for example, strengthening the oligopolistic nature of certain businesses, whether we're talking about industries like Terra or industries in the financial sector or other industries like Cargill, for example, that control more than 30% of food production in Central America. No, they control more than 40% of food production. They have almost a monopoly in poultry production. So we have to focus as the purpose of economic growth to transform the prevailing model into a modernized approach that gives more equity and access to a broader segment of the society. And one way to do that is breaking the oligopolistic sectors and modernizing the informal economy. And then you begin to gradually balance the inequities that exist in Central America. That will have an effect on migration. But more importantly, will have an effect on increasing wealth for everyone. So overall, I think the root causes strategy is a really important one. I do think we need to pair migration policy with foreign policy. We are not providing the same weight to the current problems of the rule of law in Guatemala, in Honduras, in Nicaragua, with the way we are having a strong migration control component. So, the rule of law, the deterioration of conditions, of political conditions in Central America requires a swift US response on those problems. And we're not getting there. So it's not only about the size and the amount of foreign assistance, but it's also about political capital and will. And I think that's one issue that is missing significantly in this process. So I'm just going to leave it like that. I mean, we can talk with some more detail on some of the things, but I think the issue that works is the leveraging of remittances, because you do increase wealth and also you reduce the intention to migrate. We have different projects in Central America on financial inclusion, and those who formalize their savings are less likely to migrate, whether because you put your money away and you're not entertaining your thoughts. These are behavior economic issues, psychological decisions where emotions play an important role, but also material circumstances. You see the net effect of having savings in the bank account than having them at hand. So those are important issues that we need to take more close attention to.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And I just want to Remind our audience, if you do have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them in the chat. I do have one more question for Russell. Russell, do you think that the recent efforts by USAID to increase local participation in development programs in Central America will be more effective than past efforts, and why or why not? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's certainly a good question, and I think we do think that this new focus on localization will be more effective. We have been at this for quite some time across a couple of administrations. There was a focus on this, and then the Obama administration, the Trump administration, to shift the focus to increase engagement by local groups. I think we have learned a fair amount over the last several years about this, and we're looking to build both the capacity of local groups, but also the capacity of our teams locally, and how we and also the structure through increased work through APSs, co-creation, working with some established groups that we have been working with over a long time. I mean, I think we're currently working with one example might be Glasswing, that we've been working with for a number of years, but now they're a much larger, almost international organization, where that we are working with under the Central America Service Corps initiative, among other things. So and the goal there is to provide up to 300 million, but with a goal of at least 240 million for local initiatives over the next 4 years. And I think the success will depend upon the funding and being able to get the staff that we need in the field to be able to manage that, because I think as you all know at APT and others, that the time of selecting and doing the review of vouchers and all the sort of the mundane things takes it takes people and time to do that, and so we're trying to get that staff and that team in place, and I think that is happening. We've been pushing that forward. I think one example might be the Genesis Global Development Alliance, which was co-created and is being implemented by a local private sector foundation, FUNADE. This activity is designed to increase opportunities for vulnerable populations, including youth, returned migrants, and communities with the highest crime and out-migration levels. And we've support from USAID, along with additional funding that FUNADE has brought, strengthened 61 outreach centers on a yearly basis that benefit 75,000 children and youth. And so I think it's a good example. We have others in El Salvador where we've worked with, particularly on youth, and I think sort of that it is sort of bringing the assistance more to the local level. I think is the goal here, and I think we finding that balance, which I think we're trying to do, and I think we will over the next few years of ensuring that we have the local voices that are driving some of the initiatives that we're doing. So I think that both the approach, the taking lessons learned from what we've been doing before, I think will help to ensure this initiative works. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that, Russell. All right, well, I want to thank all of our panelists today. Many thanks again for today's discussion. We have reached the question and answer portion of today's webinar, and my colleagues and I have been watching the really important questions coming in. I'm going to turn this over to my colleague Marissa, who's going to begin directing those to our panelists. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to our panelists, Manuel, Russell, and Audi, for a really fantastic discussion and for bringing lots of perspectives to highlight. And Russell, you've kind of, since we ended with you, there was a couple of questions that came in through the chat. And you talked a little bit about this, but we heard from Manuel about formalizing savings and investments into the local economy. And as he said, those who formalize their savings are less likely to migrate. And you talked about a little bit of the initiatives by country, but what are some specific initiatives and strategies that USAID has to involve the US private sector and investors in addressing the lack of economic opportunity in the region? And this is something that Audi said in her discussion as well about the lack of opportunity, the lack of jobs that really pushed her to migrate.
Yeah, ultimately that's the core issue, is how do we increase the size and scope and diversity within the formal economy. A lot of AID's assistance has been focused in the last several years on the agriculture sector, because it's where, in many ways, a third of the countries, particularly in Guatemala, is employed. And so what we've looked to do is to focus on that value chain within the agriculture sector. It also is in line with AID's Feed the Future initiative and the funding that we have for that. And so there's been a lot of focus from us on that. It also helps to address issues related to food insecurity in these regions. So it's all a bit tied together on that. I think one of the things that we've been looking to do is to partner with many of these organizations through the Vice President's Central America Forward Call to Action initiative. And we've been working with the Development Finance Corporation to help facilitate investments with local companies, the partnership with local companies, strengthening some of the local businesses and private sector groups who would be able to accept and additional outside financing because of the requirements, for outside international investment. So we've been working with a lot of those companies so that they can apply and engage with the international finance world. Because AID isn't going to take or invest directly in a local company, but what we can do is work with some of those local organizations to do that. We also are working to help facilitate worker job training so that people have the skills, so that if people were to invest, that they can do that. We've been working to advance training in textiles. We've been working to advance training in other tech sectors, so that there is worker training for those sectors. And I think on the banking sector, I think Manuel is right, about trying to figure out how to engage with remittances. And our teams in each of the three countries we've been discussing this, of how we can get people to utilize the formal banking sector more in this. And there's a little bit of trust in the system, and getting the some of those banking sectors to focus on this and on the people who are in the informal economy. Some of, I think when we talk about the political will, some of the oligarchic structures maybe intentionally ignore some of these people within the society. And we're trying to create the right incentives for some of these financial groups to do that. And I think if you look at some of the members of the Call to Action, where Microsoft and some of the others have been looking to increase financial literacy and address some of those issues without our assistance, but with their own funding. So it's again a bit where that partnership we've been trying to facilitate. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer, Russell. We have a couple of other questions in the chat, but this one for Manuel, that came a little bit earlier in the first section when you were talking about different situations in each country. You mentioned in Honduras there are homicides, or that the rate of homicides often is a factor for people to migrate. In El Salvador, gender-based violence, and as we heard from Auri, in Guatemala as well, gender-based violence was a reason that pushed her to migrate. And so this question is just to understand a little bit more of the specifics of migration in Guatemala right now. And I know that might be hard to summarize in just a few minutes, but if you could highlight a few factors around the situation of migration in Guatemala as it is now.
Let me make a caveat, and I'm going to put my academic hat, because you cannot generalize on even correlations longitudinally. That is, if the issue of migration from Honduras and Guatemala was predominantly driven by violence in the early 2010, it is not the same case today. Well, to some extent, with the exception of Honduras, but I think the pattern of violence continues to be a driver of migration. It's not a driver that only that there is a homicide in my family, I migrate, but it's the perception, or at the municipal level, the effect, the psychological effect that homicides have with crime rates increasing in the ecosystem of the community will increase my sense of insecurity and then will lead me to migrate. So it's not the immediate effect on my own life or my family that leads to migration, although in some cases that is the case. But in Guatemala, in the past 4 years at least, there's around pre-pandemic 2019 to the present, the critical factors have been mostly economic. And one of the factors that I find it to be somewhat different to the other countries is people working in the agricultural economy are more likely to migrate. Now, most of Central America is largely urban and informal. It's not rural. We have this misconception that Central America is rural. The issue is that it looks rural, but doesn't mean it is. It's just truncated economies with very ill-equipped systems, infrastructures that sometimes work, sometimes they don't work. You heard Auri Luis talking about electricity in Guatemala. So that's one important issue to take into consideration. In the case of Guatemala, the size of the labor force working in agriculture is one of the highest. It's over 30%. So those people do not make more than $150 a month, and they tend to have an increased proportion to migrate. The other factor that differentiates Guatemala from the other countries, at least in my experience, this is not doing surveys, but this is working in Guatemala on the ground on the Western Highlands. We've been working in Guatemala since 2006, is extortion. Extortion increases the intention to migrate. Now, how spread is it in terms of numbers? What percent of the 200,000 people who left Guatemala in 2022 actually did so because of extortion? It might be 1%. We don't know, and we won't know. But the common thread is the economic. Women, the nature, the composition of migration in the past 4 years has changed significantly. At least 30% of the Central American migrants that are coming to the US border, the Northern Triangle, are family groups. They're coming 2 adults and 1 child. Sometimes it's 1 adult with 2 children. This is a new phenomenon of the past 4 years that has changed some of the dynamics of migration, has also changed the purpose of or the reasons behind why people are migrating. And Guatemala and Honduras shared a lot of that factor in common. So, I will say that, Russell talked about mentioned in passing the issue of Bukele's, war on gangs and this exaggerated criminalization of gangs and punishment, etc. There is an interesting factoid here. The Salvadoran migration hasn't dropped, even though you have done a Nazi-style crackdown on these type of groups. So something else is happening. The economy of El Salvador, but it's in really bad shape. It's sustained by remittances. So, there are some factors that we really need to go back to the drawing table.
Thank you, Manuel, for your passionate explanation.
Thoughts?
Yes. Just to understand, as you mentioned, the correlations, not correlations, but how these factors impact individuals' decisions to migrate, and kind of your reflections on the strategies that are being used in the countries as well as by the U.S. government. And so I have one follow-up question for Audi, and it's kind of something that Russell has talked about in USAID's strategy to invest in communities. And this question is about kind of her thoughts on hope. And she mentioned that young people in her country are visionaries and they have a lot of capacity and potential, and the opportunities are not necessarily there. So I will switch to Spanish and ask this question. Auri, yo tengo una pregunta para ti sobre cómo hemos escuchado sobre la perspectiva del gobierno de los Estados Unidos y de la estrategia de investir en las comunidades en América Central. Y hablaste sobre qué piensas de los jóvenes en su país, de que los jóvenes son visionarios y tienen capacidad y potencial, pero ¿cuáles sus pensamientos sobre la mejor manera de inspirar esperanza en los jóvenes de sus comunidades? O los jóvenes necesitan trabajos y todo, pero ¿qué piensas que podemos hacer para inspirar esta esperanza en los jóvenes?
Gracias por la pregunta. Bueno, efectivamente mencionaba que sí, los jóvenes son visionarios. Creo que el emprendimiento es una forma que genera ingresos y eso hace que muchos jóvenes pues emprenden un negocio con un oficio de lo que ellos sepan hacer. Por ejemplo, un mecánico emprende su propio negocio a reparar vehículos. Una persona que sabe de electricidad emprende su propio negocio, es su propio jefe, empieza a realizar trabajos de electricidad. Una persona, por ejemplo, en el caso de las mujeres, una persona que sabe cortar cabello, emprende su propio negocio de cortar cabello. Una persona que sabe preparar, por ejemplo, diferentes por ejemplo, que sepa realizar, se me fue la palabra, pero que pueda preparar, por ejemplo, hablemos de pasteles, no se me viene la palabra, pero que sepa preparar pasteles va a aprender su propio negocio. Entonces, el emprendimiento es una buena opción para que muchos jóvenes pues tengan sus propios ingresos y no piensen tanto en esa forma de emigrar, ¿verdad? Irregular. Entonces, esa sería una opción, podría yo decirlo, el emprendimiento, ¿verdad? Una forma generar ingresos, los jóvenes ya no piensan tanto en migrar, sino ya piensan, por ejemplo, la forma de continuar estudiando y seguir acá en Guatemala.
Muchísimas gracias, Auri, por esa respuesta. Thank you to all of our panelists. We have reached the end of our time for this webinar, but thank you all to our attendees for your interest in this topic and for your questions. I want to just thank our panelists on behalf of Somos Apt. We really appreciate your participation today. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.